The subtlest meaning of emptiness, the subtlest meaning of dependent arising, the one that is the real meaning, is this. These are the words for it. That there is there's nothing here. There's nothing here. There's not one atom of anything here among these parts, or the aggregates as Buddha would call them, the parts, that makes this I. You see, they say we need to first realise the emptiness of the person. Then we can begin to understand the emptiness of everything else. But I think sometimes it's easier, I don't know, to understand it in relation to other things. So listen, first we have to establish there is something called a prison. Let's say we discuss a thing called a prison. What's a prison, Mummy? Well, darling, it's the word that we use to refer to an ugly place where you're sent when you're naughty and you can't escape from it. I think that's a good definition of prison, okay? Let's just say we agree. Oh, I get it. So now you understand what it is and who would want to go there. If you look up the real estate pages and you find a room free in a prison, I don't think you're going, oh, look, a free rent, I'll go there. I don't think so. Because why? Because conventionally, we understand those words. Like conventionally, we understand the word, a cup is the thing that holds my tea. We get that. We conceptualise that together, we can imagine it, and then we use it and we prove it. It holds tea. Same here. We can get the idea, a prison is an ugly place, and believe me, the ones I've been to are pretty ugly. Unless you live in Norway or Sweden, they seem to, the more north you go in Europe, the prettier prisons are, because they're more humane. So you think prison, conventionally, that's what it is. We recognise it, we hear the word. Then if I said I'm going to go to prison, you say, oh no, Robina, I'm so sorry, you wouldn't delight for me. Why? Because prison conventionally is a place where it's not cool to be, Now, this is the point about emptiness. This is the point. This is the point. The Buddha's saying, if, this is the subtlest meaning of dependent arising, if prison, which conventionally we can agree is an ugly place, and you wouldn't choose to live there, this is the point, is that in its bones, these are the words they say, from its own side, intrinsically, inherently, which means without depending on the mind calling it that, then you could never be happy there, because it would be naturally ugly. Now, I mean, this is the point. Many of my friends in prison, I've known for 20 years, are still miserable because they're in prison. Some other people I know who are in prison are happy in prison. So if prison were inherently ugly, in its bones ugly, you could never, ever, ever change the way you see it. Because Buddha finally is saying everything is made by conceptuality. Everything is how we see it. Everything is how we call it. This sounds so light somehow. It's kind of outrageous. This is the real meaning of dependent arising. And he says that's what we instinctively believe. So this is why in the Mahayana teachings, there's this amazing level, in the Bodhisattva practices, this amazing level, advanced level of practice where they talk about learning as, transform, they call it transforming problems into happiness. So what that means is conventionally, we all agree, conventionally speaking, a problem is a thing that we don't like. It's kind of obvious. A problem is a thing that attachment doesn't like, actually. A problem is a thing when attachment doesn't get what it wants, that's called a problem. The red light, the mean boss, someone not doing what you want. That's what we call a problem. A problem is a thing, what we mean is that you don't want it, you don't like it, it's a drag. It's true. So, if a problem were inherently a problem, the word is inherent. And this is a word that's ordinary in English, but you've got to learn the definition here. The definition means if something were inherent, it would be that in itself. And you could never see it any other way. You could never ever see it any other way. In other words, it would exist without depending on mind cognizing it like that. Every day we experience this. We should realize emptiness in a second if we can join the dots, you know. I see chocolate cake and I think it's disgusting, and you see chocolate cake and you get excited. That proves right there this point about emptiness. That there is no chocolate cake that is inherently delicious or inherently ugly. One person looks at it, it's delicious. One person looks at it and they vomit. This proves emptiness right there, but we never get it. Because this is the point the Buddha's saying, if prison were intrinsically, inherently, from its own side, definitely an ugly place, you know, where you don't choose to go, where you can't escape from. If it were that in its bones, in itself, nobody could ever be happy there. And we can prove it. I can tell you so many people who've changed their minds about it. This woman I always quote, this woman in Florida, 30 plus years ago, more than that now, I think I read about her. She was arrested with her husband, walking, you know, hitching in Florida, a hippie husband, hippie wife, hippie kids. And they got picked up by two blokes. And the blokes got stopped by the coppers, and the blokes killed the coppers and blamed the hippies. So they put on death row. Well, in America, you're a monster if you're on death row, especially if you kill a cop. So they were blamed, accused. He even got executed eventually. Now, can you imagine the nightmare? I mean, we can understand the nightmare. He even gets executed. And at some point, this is the thing about this woman, so amazing. I think she did yoga and meditates, and I don't think she was a Buddhist or anything. But she said, I finally realized I couldn't change anything. But they couldn't take my mind from me. So I decided, I'm not a prisoner, I'm a monk. I'm not in a cell, I'm in a cave. And we love to hear these things. It sounds so wow, amazing, far out, so noble. We can only imagine, you know. But this is the proof that there is no intrinsic prison. It's proof of it. It's proof of it. Right there, she can change her mind. Right there, when you can label it differently. And that's the thing about the way you have to understand, if you're going to understand the Buddhist view of this, you've got to learn how we establish phenomena that exist. We have to learn how we establish things. There's a definition, there's a name, there's a word, and how, as I said before, everything in the mental consciousness is a viewpoint that's made up by our minds. This is what Buddhist point is, finally. Everything is coming from conceptual mind. I mean, initially this sounds hilarious to us. It sounds inconceivable. Because we believe everything has got an innate nature out there. Nothing to do with me. Look at that, there's that cake, look at it. Begging me to eat it. Not my fault, is it? Is that not how it feels, you know? That's how it feels. There's cake out there that's completely delicious and it's not your fault. Poor me, I can't help it, and I just have to stuff the cake in. What can I do? This is how we feel, because we see everything has its own power and it's kind of compelling us to do things. Ugly people make us angry. Delicious cake makes us excited. It's not my fault. That's the way ego grasping causes us to feel as everything is out there, nothing to do with me. This is the meaning. When Buddha says, don't be ridiculous. Everything in your mind is causing that thing to appear that way. This is what Buddha's saying. You learn this in Buddhist psychology in high school. Forget waiting to hear about emptiness. This is absolutely fundamental. What's that? Oh, thank you. So, you know, it's like, to really hear this, we can kind of experience it. We understand the truth of this, you know. Everything is what we call it that. And so that the feeling of there being something intrinsic, when we come to the more sophisticated discussions about the nature of the I, the self, whatever, and these amazing yogis, starting with the Indians, or continuing with the Indians, and going through to the Tibetans, the Hindu views, the Indian views, the Buddhist views, whatever you like, there are so many subtle different interpretations. Each coming from the minds of great yogis, don't ever criticize any of them. And even among the Buddhist views, so many variations of exactly what it is that determines this and that. And the final one we're describing here, the one that seems like even all the Buddhist schools even still say there's got to be something there. There has to be something there that determines the self, otherwise there's nothing. And that's how we feel, how it sounds. So what Lama Zopa says, the words he says, it sounds too shocking for our minds. He says, it's like this. There's absolutely nothing from the side of the cup, not one atom of anything there. that's inherent, meaning not depending on something that's independent. In particular, independent of mind calling it that. So conclusion, it is therefore empty of existing inherently. They're the words. Lacking inherent, intrinsic nature. There's nothing. So we hear that, we get nervous. And we hear that there's therefore no cup. And what we do is when we hear the right view, emptiness, we instantly go to the wrong view. We go sailing off into the abyss. And we end up with the nihilistic view. Oh, well, it's all empty. There's nothing anyway. Even most Buddhists talk like this. Wrong view. Misconception. You've just thrown out too much. That great saying in English, you just chuck the baby out with the bathwater. That's what we do. Instinctively, we can't help but hear that. When we hear, like in the Heart Sutra, there's no this and no that. Oh, okay, there's no I, so it doesn't matter anyway. That's completely mistaken thinking. So it's way more nuanced than we think when we hear the words. And we can't help but hear that because we have this ego grasping that is already making that mistake. So we wrongly interpret those words. And then we hear dependent arising. There is a cup that does exist in dependence upon causes, in dependence upon parts, and finally in dependence upon the mind calling it that. And as soon as we hear relative reality, dependent arising, we immediately over-exaggerate. We go, oh, thank God, there's something after all. Grasp. That's the other extreme. So we go sailing between these two extremes like drunken sailors 1,000 times a day. Instinctively, we can't help but mishear these so-called, these are the two wrong views, as Buddha calls them, the two extreme views. We can't help, as soon as we posit something, we can't help but reify it and over-exaggerate it and freeze it in space. Every time we hear emptiness, we can't help but chuck the baby out with the bathwater. That's why hearing about the two truths forces us to put these two together and not go sailing off into the non-duality of abyss of there's nothing and nothing, which is the commonest misconception of emptiness. Or the other one, which is expressed in the creator teachings, in the soul teachings, in the Atman teachings, that there is something. There is something reified, above everything, special, holy. That's the teaching. And Buddha's arguing with both of these. The nihilistic view, there's nothing. The eternalistic view, there's something. And it's like annoying because we hear only these two extremes. And this is why Tsongkhapa says, simply quoting Buddha, the perfect way to put these two seeming contradictions together is every time we hear the words emptiness, empty of inherent existence, not existing from its own side, in and of itself, all these terms. Every time we hear that, going against the instinctive, nihilistic, oh well, there's nothing, and consciously saying to ourselves, hearing that there is no I from its own side, hearing those words, and instead of pulling yourself away from the abyss and then saying to yourself, that means, Robina, there is a dependent arising I. And then as soon as we hear there is a dependent arising I, then every time we want to over-exaggerate that, which of course the massive instinct is to do that, it's a great relief to think there's an I after all. So instead of over-exaggerating it, you say to yourself, but ha-ha, Robina, that means there is no I from its own side. So you catch yourself. And in the end, middle way, the middle way view, it's all used in very many weird ways they talk about middle way. The real middle way view is when finally you're a Buddha, actually. And the concept, the actual reality of dependent arising and the reality of emptiness appear to your mind simultaneously because they're referring to the same thing. They're pointing to the same thing. They're not contradictory. Now with the extreme views, depending on how deluded we are, you completely go to the abyss of there's nothing, there's nobody, which is profound depression. You might as well kill yourself. There's nothing anyway. And the other one is all the overexcited about there is something, wow, fantastic up there, holy, wow, delicious, bliss, bliss, bliss. The other extreme. That's a better one. If you're going to do anything, believe in a creator, please. Nothing wrong with that. Better. At least that's one. Won't make you crazy. The nihilistic one's a nightmare. There's nothing. Total disaster. So the middle way is in between where these two come together. But that's why the two truths is a perfect way to bring the two together. Are we communicating here? All we can do is think about it, read about it, study. I mean, here, like I said, all of this, there's no way we can comprehend this and we just pluck it out of nowhere and start trying to understand it itself. It's ridiculous. It's like stupid. To even try, it's ridiculous. And people get so greedy sometimes that I want to meditate emptiness, I want to realize emptiness, get a sudden flash, oh wow, I had a moment of emptiness, grasp, grasp, grasp. It's ridiculous. It's like childish. It's not going to come out of the blue, okay? A lot of hard work to do. And the hard work is first controlling your body and speech and living in morality and keeping vows. Then you go to high school, you learn concentration, meditation, and you understand Buddhist psychology, and you work on your mind every single day, controlling your anger, your jealousy, your depression, your low self-esteem, stop blaming other people. This is already stupendous practice. This is preparing us. So then when we think about emptiness, read about it, it begins to make sense. Without it, it's like a joke. To think that we can go straight there is like ridiculous, Leaping into university straight off. It's just plain silly. And the fact is, emptiness is not separate from all the other stuff. It's the conclusion that you come to from all the other. Karma and about the mind are the fundamentals that enable you to comprehend the meaning of dependent arising and emptiness. Sometimes we think about emptiness, it's only the bad things that are empty. But as soon as you hear that Buddha's empty, oh, that's a bit confusing. Oh dear, really? Because we think of it nihilistically, you see. It's so subtle. The points are so subtle. So it means it means questioning all the time our assumptions, understanding these words, getting the right definitions, understanding what you're saying. You can't understand music without the theory. You can't understand anything without the words. Don't ever think that you can understand this without the words. It's like a joke. Yes, you can have a taste of something. You have a taste. But taste is not enough. It's not enough, It's like you might be very musical and you sit at the piano and you put your hands on and something very musical comes out. And I go, oh, that's wonderful. Please play it again. Oh, no, I can't do that. It was just a moment. That's how we think of spiritual, as like magical moments that pop up out of nowhere. It's just superstitious. It's a good taste. It's nice to get experiences, but we've got to get it to be stable so you can get the experience every time. So you go practice theory, then you can play Mozart every time. Same with this. Slowly, slowly, So this is also the way to live your life. When you live your life this way, when you die, you realise that death is also dependent arising. Death is also empty of inherent nature. Then death is easy. You welcome it. Everything's empty. Everything. It's a shorthand. Everything lacks an inherent nature. And the Buddha's simple point, there can be nothing that doesn't depend on something. That's all it means. There can be nothing that exists without depending on something. In particular, finally, the subtlest one, mind calling it that. Because everything in the universe is made by conceptuality. That's really abstract for us. And that's the understanding karma helps us understand that. And finally, when you're an enlightened being, you're beyond conceptuality. Which is so abstract for us again, because we can't conceive of anything else. So when, using the two truths as our example again, whenever we think of emptiness, it should remind us of dependent arising. And the first level of dependent arising is causes and conditions, which is karma. So if we think that emptiness contradicts karma, that's when we're heading in the wrong direction. That's why to think of emptiness, it reminds you of dependent arising. When you think of dependent arising, it should remind you of emptiness. Then you're moving in the right direction towards the middle way, not to the two extremes. That's when we're on the right track. And the other thing that's so interesting about understanding emptiness is Rinpoche says, when we realise emptiness, there is no fear. Can we even conceive of this? You know? And that's what's interesting, going right back to the mind, as we've been talking all week. We understand the Buddhist model of the mind, how these mental states function, all the neuroses, for example. People often in the West, modern psychology, say, well, they look at all the list of different states of mind that Buddhist psychology will talk about. And then people often say, well, where does fear fit in? Well, guess what? All the delusions, all the neuroses are in the nature of fear. There's no separate state of mind called fear. The most primordial level of these delusions is the root delusion, ego grasping, the one that clings to the I and everything else. And that's its most primordial nature is fear. You know how in the West Mr. Darwin talks about instinct for survival? It's a really good example, actually. Let me tell you a story. Lama Zopa Rinpoche. He's a Sherpa, okay, Nepali. He was recognized as a little boy as the reincarnation of a Nyingma yogi called Kunsang Yeshe up in the mountains, up in Solokhumbu. He was this lay yogi, like a lot of them up there, Nyingma yogis, lay people. And he was like a back and forth to Tibet, selling and buying salt, whatever, had a family. And then in the last few years of his life, which is not uncommon, there was this little hole in the wall. He said Guru Rinpoche gave it to him. And basically they stored the radishes there. So he pulled out the radishes and moved in, And apparently, I don't speak these languages, but apparently he's known as it's known as Laudo, Lawudo. It's a little village up there, which is where that cave is, and that apparently means radishes. Or maybe it's onions, I never know which one. Anyway, he's known as the Radish Lama, the Laudo Lama. He moved into this little cave, and he spent the last 20-something years of his life there. Great Vajrayana yogi, going through all this process of practicing all these great, these practices which enable him to go through the death process really clearly, like we talked. Chose his next rebirth. There he is, new little one called Zopa. And so his sister said, she's about 78 now, she runs Laudo. She's been running it, she's a nun, since Rinpoche was recognised as a little boy. So anyway, he was like the third kid, I think, in his family. And his mother, anyway, whatever. So apparently, the sister said about Lama Zopa, as soon as the mother would turn her back, little Zopa, they find him crawling up the mountain to where they know the Laudo cave is. So Mummy drags him home. So then from the time he can talk, he's walking up the mountain. And they'd say, come home, Mummy would say. He'd say, no, that is my home. So apparently when he played games, his sister said, he'd always play the role of a lama. He'd make mud pie dorjis and mud pie bells, and he would announce that all his benefactors were coming to the puja, and he'd announce the names of his past life benefactors. Well, I mean, this is not uncommon behaviour for what they call reincarnated little lamas, because when you're very small, you don't lose your memory, because they choose their next rebirth and they know what's going on, I remember even Denma Lodro Rinpoche, it's wonderful lama who lived up in Dharamsala. In his biography, he talks about when he was a very tiny baby, because he had crystal clarity about who he was. He was most frustrated being in this little baby's body because he couldn't do what he wanted to do, because they've retained their memory. They choose where to get born. So Lama Zopa is said to be like this. Anyway, the point is his mummy saw all this behaviour, so she figured she better check with the local lamas. So they had the divinations done, and then they said, yes, indeed, it would seem he is the reincarnation of the Laudo Lama, Kunsang Yeshe. Anyway, the story goes like this. He's about 8 years old and he told this story later. He's way up in the mountains, up in a monastery with his manager, as a manager. And he's 8 years old, and there's this big river, and across the river, this would have been in 1954. Well, these very strange looking people. He said they were pale-faced, with pale eyes and straw-coloured hair. Well, I think he's saying white people. He's never seen white people before, So he wanted to meet these white people. He's never heard of white people. So So he wants to meet these pale-faced people, you know, strange, pale eyes, straw-coloured hair. Doesn't sound very exciting, does it? Anyway, he's determined to go, so he brings a bowl of potatoes. His manager said he shouldn't go, but he wanted to go, so he had a bowl of potatoes. He's walking across the bridge, and the rickety little bridge, and he falls in. So they don't teach him swimming up there, right? So he's drowning. And this is how he told the story. He said, he's drowning, okay? And he said, the thought occurred to me. The person known as the Laudo Lama is about to die, he said to himself, 8 years old. So already that's an indication he's realised emptiness, because a whole kind of practice of stopping tricking ourselves, to trick ourselves and to stop grasping at this I. It's really good to talk to yourself like, I'm the person called Robina. Technically, this is not Robina. These are the aggregates of the person known as Robina. And it's really good to talk to self like this, especially about your delusions, you know. There's anger saying this, and there's jealousy saying that, and there's love, instead of I'm jealous, I'm angry, I'm depressed. This big I, you know, walking around like a big mountain. It's skillful means to help your mind be more spacious about yourself, you know. So automatically, 8 years old, he said, the person known as a Laudo Lama is about to die. And then he said, I didn't know anything about emptiness. Meaning, of course, in that life, up to the age of 8, he'd not heard the teachings yet. He said, I didn't know anything about emptiness, but there was no fear. This is the point. This is the point that I think should be so exciting to us. We all know anxiety. We worry. We never stop. It's our main activity, worry, anxiety. Look at the people now who have what you call panic attacks. Regular, common. This is because of ego grasping. And all the delusions, they are in the nature of fear. Now this sounds so abstract to us. So abstract, but hear it. Buddha's saying all these states of mind under the heading negative, the neurotic ones, the afflictions, the delusions, the liars, the misconceptions, because they are misconceptions, because they are liars, that's why we suffer. This seems too abstract to us. Because we're believing in those lies. Because whatever we're seeing, experiencing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, thinking about, is appearing to us as existing from its own side. And all Buddha's saying is, sorry honey, they don't exist like that. So because one is there is reality, and two, there is our conception, and there's this disconnect between these two, that's why we suffer, and that's why suffer means fear. So when you realize emptiness, there is no fear. When you realize there is no intrinsic I to cling to, therefore there's no attachment, because that's the main voice of the intrinsic I, and therefore there's no anger and no jealousy and no other delusions. How can there be logically? So there is no fear. But nevertheless, he still went to the surface to get air, because it's a reasonable thing to do. But the view that the scientific view says, if you didn't have this panic, you would. That's what saves you. Buddha says, don't be silly. What saves you is called wisdom, not panic. It's the opposite. But that's inconceivable to us, to think you could be fearless, literally beyond fear. Literally, as you're being shot, there'd be no fear. That's impossible to us. We can't believe it. Because why? Because modern psychology asserts this is natural. So as I said, even not having anger, you'd be considered unnatural. The Buddha says not even ego grasping is that, you know. You'd be completely unnatural without instinct for survival. So it's kind of interesting psychology. Are we communicating?
Who saved him?
Oh, probably obviously the manager. What do you think? There's only him and the manager, so we can deduce the rest. He didn't tell the rest of the story. It's obvious.
I thought the pale people had...
No, the pale people might have as well, I'm not sure. Maybe he didn't fall off. Maybe he's just in the beginning of the bridge. I didn't get those details. It's a good point. Maybe it was the pale people, yeah. The straw-coloured hair people. So maybe back to death for a little bit.
Can you just talk us through how death is empty?
Death is the name we give to a series of events. Cup is a name we give to a series of parts, right? Isn't it? I is the name we give to these bits and pieces here. So death is simply a mind and a body separating. But because of grasping, because of seeing myself as permanent, because of seeing myself as inherent, because of clinging to my body, believing the body is me, and then clinging to my partners and my beloveds and my mummy and my money and my pension plan and my house and the things that I see every day in my life, all our life, what else is life but all the accumulated things that we've got, that we see every day, that we believe are self-existent, that we believe are mine, that we believe we can't exist without. We spend our lives supporting them, we spend our life looking after them, we spend our life maintaining them, we spend our life protecting them, we spend our life accumulating them. What else? All our life we've been seeing them as permanent, seeing them as self-existent, seeing this body as permanent, seeing myself as permanent, seeing this person as self-existent. So of course there is just massive terror at the time of death. Typical, normal, most people's death is fearful, extremely fearful, because of all these wrong assumptions. So when we have some semblance of not grasping at permanence, we've given up attachment to the me and the mine, then naturally, and then thought about impermanence throughout our life, confronted it, then when it does come, there's no denial of it, there's an acceptance of it, and then even more subtly, when you realise it's simply the name we give to the passing, the separating of body and mind. That's all. Dependent arising. Dependent arising, that's it. It's a dependent arising. Death is the name we give to the separating of body and mind. Cup is the name we give to the thing that holds my tea. Robina is the name we give to these bits of body and mind. But we don't hear it as simply as that. We put all the as Lama Zopa says, all these delusions decorate on top of what is there. This is exactly the point about delusions, not just the ego grasping, all the delusions. These delusions, grasping at permanence, attachment, anger, pride, jealousy, depression, low self-esteem, all of the packaging, all the dramas in our head, all these liars, rooted in the biggest lie of all. So these delusions all decorate on top of what is there, layers upon layers upon layers upon layers of characteristics that just aren't there. So even just deconstructing death throughout our life and thinking about it and confronting it without even thinking about it as being empty, which is much more subtle, even that lessens fear. So Buddha's saying in general, all delusions cause fear because they're all liars. And then we believe in them. So forget even the root lie. That's the subtlest of all. But even just stopping believing in permanence, which is a much grosser mistake. Stop even believing that the husband belongs to me. Stop believing the child belongs to me. Even lessening those delusions, lessening attachment, lessening aversion, lessening jealousy. That lot of lies, which are grosser lies. Even lessening those lies, stopping believing in those lies can cause death to be less fearful. The most dramatic lie, the subtlest, is the lie of inherent me. Then cutting that one, then really truly death is not only not fearful, it's blissful. So the key thing here, the bigger point I find most powerful, and that we get from studying the mind in high school, forget about the emptiness, is to see, understand how these disturbing emotions, these mental afflictions, these afflicted emotions, and they're the terms that His Holiness and other Lamas use all the time, which is one component of the lies. The two main components of these neuroses, one is that they're disturbing. They're deeply disturbing. That's evident to any of us. That we can feel. But the other one is, for me, so tasty, which is why I like to use the word delusion. Because it's hitting the nail on the head. That shows that these disturbing emotions are liars. Literally misconceptions. They're not valid, they're all opinions, they're all viewpoints, but they're not valid viewpoints. They're lying points. They distort what's there. This is the function of all the delusions. Forget the root delusion. When we get that, then even just lessening attachment, lessening anger, lessening depression, lessening jealousy, it can make death less fearful. It's just a question of degree, that's all. And then if you realise emptiness, that's the bonus. Because there is no death in and of itself. It's just the parting of body and mind. And it's that because we call it that. But it is that. It functions as that. The mind does leave the body. So the thing with it, when we hear this process of deconstructing something, it sounds like a diminishing of it. It's not like meant to be that way. Because when you hear about the emptiness of a Buddha, it's the same discussion. And it's hard to get this because when we hear that it's not this, it's not that, it's not this, it sounds like you're diminishing it and you end up with, oh, well, this again, nihilism. That's the wrong view, you see. So the key one is to see how these delusions are based in fear. I find that utterly fascinating. So by confronting something, you lessen the fear. It's because of living in denial of something, not wanting to look at something, not wanting to analyse it. That's why fear comes. And the main reason at death why there's so much fear is because of attachment. Forget ego grasping. It's the main cause of all the incredible fear of death. Attachment, clinging, grasping.
So you spoke of the cup as the nihilistic way and the other, and then there was a middle way. How would that be? Could you just say that part again, please? What is the middle way view of looking at it? All of this?
As I've been saying, I understand. The wrong view, forget the cup, think of I. The wrong view is, well, there's no I from its own side, there's no I from its own side, there's no inherent I, there's no intrinsic I, there's nothing in the I that I can find that makes me the I. So the natural instinctive feeling is, oh, well, there's no I. That's the nihilistic view. Do you understand? That's the nihilistic one. Incorrect. Wrong assumption. Wrong conclusion. Just chuck the baby out with the bathwater. Then the other one is, there is an I that does exist in dependence upon causes, in dependence upon parts, and finally in dependence upon the mind calling this Robina. As soon as we hear that, we go to the wrong view of reification, concretizing, making it eternal and permanent and special, and there is something there. Wow, great. That's the other extreme view. That extreme view is what Buddha is arguing with, to different degrees of subtlety that's presented in the Christian teachings, the concept of a permanent partless God, the concept of something subtle there, a little tiny Atman that's not, that is making something what it is. These are the many variations of that view of the permanent eternalistic one. That's the other extreme view in general. And as soon as we hear there is something, we can't help but over-exaggerate the somethingness. As soon as we hear there's nothing, we can't help but under-exaggerate it and say there's nothing and throw the baby out with the bathwater. They're the two extreme views we run between. So the practice is, even intellectually, every time I hear the words which are correct, there is no Robina from her own side. There is not one atom of anything here that makes it Robina. Meaning there's nothing here that doesn't depend upon causes, parts, and concepts calling it that. So as soon as I hear that, or even just the word emptiness, so I consciously counteract the tendency to fall off into the abyss, and I will say to myself, ha ha, Robina, that means there is a dependent arising Robina. And every time I talk about a dependent arising Robina, and I'm sighing with relief that there is something after all, phew, I will say to myself, ha ha, no Robina, that means there is no Robina from her own side. So these two, every time we say them, when we hear emptiness, we know it means dependent arising. When we hear dependent arising, we know it means emptiness. So instead of sailing off that direction and sailing off that direction, we're coming in towards the middle way, where whenever we hear emptiness, we hear dependent arising. Whenever we hear dependent arising, we hear emptiness. And finally, when we achieve omniscience and we've removed all the obstacles in the mind, this will be a simultaneous realization. Emptiness and dependent arising will appear simultaneously to our mind. They say that Lord Buddha's, in the picture of Shakyamuni, the statue, his eyes being half open, half closed. This is indicating this awareness of emptiness and dependent arising simultaneously. They say even the greatest yogis in meditation are meditating absorbed in the absence of inherent existence. And when they open their eyes in daily life, things appear. It's only finally when we're enlightened that these two appear simultaneous as non-contradictory. So we practice knowing that emptiness means dependent arising, and dependent arising means emptiness. Instinctively, we don't think that. That's why it's crucial to think this, because then we're in the right direction. Then we're going in the right direction. Does that make sense?
That's great. Thank you.
Okay.
That's very useful.
Because you look at emotionally how we are in the daily life. It's very fascinating, seems to me. This is my way of saying it, okay? You know, you could argue that when attachment gets what it wants every day, that's what we call happiness. Look when you're in love with somebody, just to say, extreme happiness, extreme joy. Look how we talk. Finally, I found happiness. This is the permanent view. This is the eternalistic view. We're over-imposing upon it. Now we've got it, which means it won't change. I always quote Nicole Kidman. Excuse me. I've read all these magazines because I find it very helpful to understand about human nature, because we're all human beings. So I'm a great fan of all the magazines. So I read in Vanity Fair, like this is when Nicole Kidman was still with Tom Cruise, and she said at the end of the interview, "We will be together until we're 80. She said that. Now, look at us, our lives. Like all of you guys have just come from a home. I presume you're not homeless, right? Somebody has a bed somewhere. We all have a bed somewhere, don't we? Now, listen, look at our mind. This is permanent grasping. Forget the deeper grasping. As we walk out this door, every one of us is going towards home. You agree? And you expect with absolute certainty that your home will be there, don't you? Do we not expect that? Right now, look in your mind. Like as a scientific truth, isn't it? That your husband will be there, the kids will be there, the house will be there, the money will be in the bank. This is even, forget the deeper delusion of seeing it as self-existent. This is the delusion of seeing things as permanent, which is a pretty intense one to realize, and it can lead us to understand emptiness. We assume, because we left it this morning, we assume it'll be there this afternoon. That's why we believe we're permanent. We believe our life is permanent, meaning because it's there now, of course it'll be there later. You know, when you hear about a person who died, we'll say, oh no, it can't be. I just saw her yesterday. I mean, what's that got to do with the price of fish? Because you saw her yesterday, she has to be here today. That's the point. This is the grasping at things as permanent. This we can really see is a lie. But this is what we do. Forget emptiness, that's even more subtle. This leads us to emptiness. It's a fantastic teaching. We assume because it's like that now, all nice and put our home, our this, our that, just the stuff we accept, then we assume it will not change. It's so clear. This is why we think because I'm alive today, I'll be alive tomorrow. Of course we think that. It's a complete joke. But we and it's obvious this is a lie, but we fall into this trap every single day, and we talk about it with seriousness. So this is an expression of this eternalistic view. So Nicole Kidman, there she was living with Tom, and life was good. They had the kids, they had home, they were in love with each other, all the things you take for granted, you do this, hi darling, how are you? This long history is there. And so she assumed, because it felt good today, she assumed we will be together until we are 80. This is grasping at things as permanent. This is a simple way of putting this eternalistic view. This is like attachment mode. You've got everything you like, so we're all perky and excited. So we can't even believe it will change. Is this not true? Now, look at how she was when Tom left her. For Penelope Cruz, in fact. I read all the news. Do you understand? And she talked about, I read other interviews, and there she was in fetal position on the ground in despair. Now look at this. This is emotionally the nihilistic view. Look when you're depressed, when everything's collapsed, the bubble has burst. Come on in, sit down. Where's Samten? Please take care of this gentleman. So are we communicating here? Look at this other view. So when the bubble burst and the fantasy she thought was permanent collapsed and in fact changed, which is the way life is, then she went crashing down to despair, isn't it? So emotionally, what's that? That's called depression. But what's depression? Nothing worthwhile. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. Now you believe that is permanent. That's why people kill themselves, because you can't see that that's going to change. So this grasping at things as permanent is the way we live every day. That's why we have up and down, like bipolar, the up mode is the up mode of bipolar. Everything's gorgeous, divine, perfect, wow, fantastic, blah, blah, blah. It'll last forever. And then the bubble bursts, you go crashing to despair. And now you can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And that's why you kill yourself. There's nothing worth living for. Nothing worth living for. There's nothing to look forward to. That's the depression one. It's got the energy of nihilism. This has got the energy of eternalism. These are the wrong views at deeper levels in our minds naturally. No wonder we go up and down like yo-yos all day. Can you hear me, people? We recognize this stuff, and all this because of the root delusion. So when that's gone, when the root delusion is gone, there's no longer fear, there's no longer attachment, no longer anger, no longer grasping at permanence. You're now in sync with reality, which means the mind is blissful. Please hear Buddha's words. He's not meaning some holy place in heaven. Literally, your mind is blissful. Literally, your mind is blissful. This is just the way the mind is, Buddha says, when it's rid of all the rubbish. The up and down like mad yo-yos, up and down 1,000 times a day. This is called samsara. It's psychological. Or some holy thing, So the main practice is seeing things as they exist. Not some cosmic idea. And when we understand that, the ordinary delusions then will lead us easily to understand emptiness. No big deal. It'll be the natural next step, because it's the subtler delusion. It's the subtler delusion, But they all function the same way. They're liars. And then, as Rinpoche says, again, putting these two truths together, as Rinpoche puts it, when we have realized emptiness of whatever, the clock, the cup, the person, it's as if there is no cup, but there is. But what does exist is so subtle, it's as if it doesn't. This is exactly the experience of the yogis, That's so tasty. When you've realized emptiness, it's as if there is no I, but there is. But what does exist is so subtle, it's as if it doesn't. It's as if it's an illusion. These words are so meaningful, not just cosmic, hippy-trippy words, Right now we're the extremes. Grasp like vampires, want to kill ourselves. The two extremes, This one is more and more stable. The more and more we understand these two truths together, the more stable, the more reasonable, the more regular, the more fearless, the more brave, then the more compassionate, the more wise and everything. All this is experiential, it's not just some intellectual nonsense, So also, as Tsongkhapa puts it in one of his texts, this microphone seems to be running out of power. Well, you just turned me down a bit, did you? Is it okay? It's working? I don't know, it just seems like croaking a bit, isn't it? I seem to be getting closer and closer to it, that's all. It's okay. It's all right. Okay, so another nice way to think of this is like this. Tsongkhapa, in one of his wonderful little texts called The Hymns of Experience, he says, this is where the yogi, okay, the Mahayana yogi, in their daily life, they're bopping around, helping sentient beings, practicing bodhicitta, helping sentient beings, accumulating merit, practicing the perfections. In their meditation, they're meditating on emptiness. So they say, when the yogi is meditating on emptiness, because the mind has gone to the subtler level, they are absorbed in the absence of even any appearances. They're absorbed in the concept, in the realization of the emptiness of inherent existence. They're absorbed in emptiness. Then in their daily life, they wake up and they're bopping around the universe. Still, everything appears to them. That's how they talk. Everything appears, all the cups and toilets and people and war zones and goods and bads and taras and this and frames and whatever, all the conventional phenomena. But they don't get caught up in them anymore. They're not. They say that's why they always use this nice analogy. You see it in the texts, where there's a magician who's able, through the power of like mantra or whatever, to conjure a horse. So the audience sees the horse and believes it is a horse. The magician also sees the horse, but doesn't believe in the horse, knows it's an illusion. So this is the analogy they use for the yogis and how we have to practice every day in real life. Things is all to the yogi, everything will still appear out there without depending on your mind seeing it, without realizing that our mind is conceptualizing it, our concepts are causing it to appear that way to us. But they don't get caught up in it. They don't believe it's true. So as Tsongkhapa says, when you're in your meditation, you're absorbed in emptiness, and then you pop out of your meditation, you realize that everything is not inherently existent, not existing from its own side, is like an illusion, in that it's not existing from its own side, but listen to this, but that nevertheless it functions in exactly the way we have established. So this is where you put these two truths together. On the one side, there is not one atom of anything there that makes it that. But nevertheless, it functions exactly as we established. It holds my tea. This is irrefutable, you can't deny that. So it's infuriating because when we hear this one, it seems to think there's no cup. But right there, you put your water in there and it holds your tea. So right there, boom, put your tea in, it holds the cup. So there's nothing from its own side, but guess what? It's like an illusion. It's like an illusion insofar as it does hold your tea, but when you analyse, you can find nothing from the side of the cup. This is a seeming contradiction, but these are the right words for it. And this will lead us in the right direction. Like an illusion, they say.